Have you ever had that experience where your computer just keeps crashing, like, over and over again?
Oh, absolutely. It's the worst.
Right. And at first, you probably do what we all do. You blame the recent software update, or maybe you think you downloaded some malicious file somewhere.
Or you just blame yourself for having like 80 tabs open at the same time.
Exactly. But eventually, after the 100th crash, when you've wiped the hard drive and reinstalled everything and it still freezes,
You have to stop and wonder.
yeah, you have to ask if the problem isn't the software at all. You start to realize there might be a fundamental, totally unfixable flaw in the operating system itself.
And that analogy perfectly captures the core philosophy of the source material we're examining today. Because when an entire system is built on a faulty premise, no amount of troubleshooting, no matter how skilled the technicians are, is going to keep that system from just collapsing under its own weight.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking that concept of a fundamentally flawed operating system and applying it to an entire nation. Today, we're focusing on the nation of Sudan.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. And our source material for this conversation is a thoroughly detailed, incredibly structurally complex proposal titled the Sudan Local Authority Project. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore this document's radical, ground-up blueprint for completely redesigning a country's governance.
It's basically a masterclass in system design.
Yeah, it breaks down how to shift a nation from a state of absolute centralization to a model that empowers the absolute smallest local units.
The premise that makes this document so compelling, like right from the introduction, is how it reframes the blame for Sudan's recurring crises.
How so?
Well, the authors argue that the issue isn't simply a failure of the elites or a string of bad leadership or the fault of any specific political faction.
Which is usually where the blame goes.
Right. Instead, the document posits that there is a catastrophic structural error in how power is fundamentally distributed. The operating system of the state is designed in a way that mathematically guarantees failure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the text uses a very specific phrase to diagnose this disease. It calls the current structure absolute centralization.
Absolute centralization.
For a listener who follows global geopolitics, centralization usually just means all the government buildings are in the capital.
Mm-hmm.
But this document is talking about something much more pervasive than just geography, isn't it?
Oh, it goes way beyond just having the ministries located in Khartoum. The source details a centralization of absolutely everything required to sustain life and society. We are talking about the centralization of political power, wealth, the military, culture, education, public services,
Wow.
even administrative supply chains. The text argues that if there's a problem anywhere in the country, the authority and the resources to fix that problem must legally and administratively originate from the center.
And the document makes a profound claim regarding who actually suffers under this structure.
Yeah.
It explicitly states that this system marginalizes literally everyone. People from the north, the east, the center, Kordofan, Darfur, and even the general population of Khartoum itself. But how does a system marginalize the very people living in the center of power?
The text provides a rather staggering metric to explain this. It points out that less than 2% of the population act as the owners of the center.
2%.
Less than 2%. That tiny fraction holds the keys to the wealth, the decision-making apparatus, and the monopoly on force.
So what happens to the rest?
The other 98% of the country, regardless of whether they live in a distant rural province or right in the shadow of the presidential palace, are essentially left to fight over whatever resources trickle down. It's a system designed to serve the administrative apparatus itself rather than the citizens it supposedly governs.
Wait, less than 2%? I mean, how does a nation even function when 98% of the population is structurally locked out of the decision-making process? That just sounds like a recipe for constant gridlock.
What's fascinating here is how the document links that specific bottleneck directly to the country's macro-level failures. The authors connect this 2% bottleneck to Sudan's economic collapse, the repeated failures of its democratic transitions, and its endless internal conflicts.
Because everyone is trying to squeeze through that same tiny door.
Exactly. The text argues that waiting for a tiny handful of political groups to reach an agreement just so the rest of the country can simply survive is an entirely unsustainable model. You have millions of people pouring their needs into a massive funnel, and everything has to squeeze through this microscopic spout at the bottom.
So the violent conflicts we see making international headlines would then be the symptom, not the actual disease.
Precisely.
The pressure builds up in that bottleneck until it inevitably explodes.
The document is uncompromising on that point. Centralizing all power and resources guarantees friction. And in a geopolitical context, structural friction almost always manifests as violence.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because to address that violence, the text pivots to one of its most provocative solutions. It tackles the military and the security apparatus head on.
Which is always the hardest part of any structural reform.
Right. If centralizing the military effectively treats the rest of the country like a staging ground for the center's wars, how does the document propose fixing that?
Yeah.
You obviously can't just dissolve the concept of a national defense.
Yeah, you can't. But the authors argue that leaving the ministries of defense and interior entirely controlled from the center, without any state-level oversight, is inherently dangerous to the population.
So what's their alternative?
The solution they propose is the creation of what they call state reserve forces.
Okay.
These would be specific security forces made up exclusively of local citizens from that particular state. Their constitutional mandate would be to protect those local citizens and deploy during local disasters.
And who controls them?
Crucially, these forces would be under the direct control of the state parliament, not the federal government in the capital.
I'm curious about the mechanics of that. How do you build a local force that doesn't just become, a private militia for a regional warlord? Does the text break down how these state reserve forces are actually formed and trained?
It does, and it outlines a highly structured, civilian integrated model. It envisions a force open to willing citizens between the ages of 18 and 40.
So a standard recruiting age.
Right. And the initial training period is set at 6 months. After that, to ensure these individuals remain fully integrated into their communities, the ongoing training requirement is just 2 days every month.
Just 2 days a month.
2 days a month plus 2 full weeks a year.
That sounds somewhat similar to a localized National Guard model, where the people holding the weapons have a vested personal interest in the safety of the specific neighborhoods they live in.
The civilian integration is the core safeguard here. The text highlights that these recruits are compensated with financial support, study grants, and health care from the state.
Oh, so there are major incentives.
Huge incentives, and the explicit goal is for them to return to their normal civilian jobs, their farms, or their university studies when they aren't actively training or called up for a state emergency. They are members of the community first, and a reserve force second.
And I noticed this document also mentions a separate state police force. I imagine that operates on a similar philosophy of decentralizing the monopoly on force.
Yes, the proposal establishes a state police force that would cooperate with the federal police but remain distinctly under state control. The overarching security philosophy here is about distributing the monopoly on violence.
Because if the center doesn't have all the guns,
Exactly. When a single central entity no longer holds all the weapons, it becomes structurally impossible to use a centralized military against a vast, diverse population without facing immediate organized friction at the state level.
security is obviously the most pressing issue in an active crisis. But the document spends a massive amount of time on cultural and administrative bottlenecks as well. Let's look at the cultural side, specifically education.
This is a really vital part of their argument.
The text argues that centralized education is actually a primary driver of ethnic and cultural friction in Sudan.
The source identifies that a single, top-down educational curriculum dictated entirely by a federal ministry in the capital ignores the rich, diverse realities of different regions.
It's a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't fit anyone.
Right, and forcing a monolithic cultural narrative onto a highly diverse population breeds deep resentment. It sends a clear message to local communities that their specific history, their languages, and their heritage are not valuable enough to be part of the official state narrative.
So the proposed fix is to hand that power back to the communities. The text suggests that local administrative units should manage their own school administrations, hire their own teachers locally, and have the authority to introduce supplementary curricula that reflect their specific cultural heritage.
It is about empowering the community to shape the minds of its next generation, rather than outsourcing that vital task to a distant bureaucrat who has literally never visited the region. And speaking of distant bureaucrats, the text points to a highly specific, painful consequence of centralized administration, the catastrophe of salary cuts.
The document mentions this as an ongoing current crisis, where local public workers simply aren't getting paid. And it frames this not as a lack of funds, but as an administrative failure.
Think about the massive logistical challenges currently facing various regions in Sudan.
Okay.
Imagine trying to get agricultural subsidies out to farmers in Kordofan before the planting season ends, or authorizing emergency repairs to a failing electrical grid in a regional city.
Under a centralized system, you can't just do it.
No, under the current centralized system, a local official cannot simply authorize those funds or dispatch those repair teams. The paperwork has to travel hundreds of miles to a desk in Khartoum, where it sits under a mountain of millions of other regional crises from all over the country.
Just waiting for a signature.
Exactly. The document uses the salary crisis to illustrate why localizing administration is vital for basic state functionality. When a teacher's paycheck requires federal approval, the system is fundamentally broken.
So what does this all mean? How do you actually build a system that fixes this level of systemic rot? This is where the document shifts from political philosophy to a literal mathematical blueprint for local authority.
And the text is incredibly precise with its math. It references the latest census data, noting that Sudan has a population of 40,782,700 people spread across 18 states.
Okay, 18 states.
Under this newly proposed operating system, those states are divided into localities, and those localities are further divided into administrative units.
State down to locality, down to the administrative unit.
Yeah.
At that lowest local level, the proposal makes a very specific structural choice regarding leadership. It firmly rejects the idea of a mayor system. Why is that?
The document argues that installing a single mayor at the local level simply recreates the disease of centralization on a smaller scale.
Oh, that makes sense.
It risks creating local dictators and monopolies of interest, where one individual holds all the local power, the patronage networks, and the resource distribution.
Instead, it advocates for a council and executive manager system. The citizens elect a local council, and that council holds the actual authority. They then treat the executive manager as an employee.
Exactly. The council has the power to hire and fire the executive manager, as well as specific commissioners for departments like health and education, based purely on their competence and performance.
To really make this concrete for the reader, the text walks through a highly detailed mathematical example using White Nile State. It notes that White Nile State has 2,410,300 people and is divided into 9 localities.
Right. Let's look at their test case.
Let's zoom in on the math for just one of those 9 localities. The document uses the Rabak locality as its test case, explaining that Rabak is made up of 3 administrative units: Rabak City, Abba Island, and Asalaya.
Here is where the math dictates the distribution of power. If the Rabak locality has a 20-member council, those seats are strictly distributed by population size based on the census.
So it's proportional.
Completely proportional. So Rabak City gets 10 seats, Abba Island gets 7 seats, and Asalaya gets 3 seats.
And the document implements a fascinating rule regarding how those seats are filled. The golden rule of this blueprint is that only residents of a specific unit can vote for their representatives.
Yes.
If you live in Asalaya, you only vote for the 3 Asalaya seats. You cannot vote in Rabak City's election, and Rabak City cannot vote in yours.
That mechanism guarantees that even the smallest, most historically marginalized unit has guaranteed mathematically protected representation at the table.
Because otherwise the big city just takes over.
Exactly. A larger neighboring city cannot use its sheer population advantage to sweep the entire council and lock the smaller unit out of the decision-making process.
And from that local council, how does this structure scale up to the national level?
The system scales up using that exact same logic of population-based, bottom-up delegation. The seats in the state parliament are distributed by the population of the localities.
Give us an example of that.
Well, the text provides the example of a 50-seat White Nile State Parliament. The highly populated Kosti locality would get 8 seats, while the Rabat locality gets 7.
Got it.
Then, taking it to the very top, the members of the national parliament are nominated from within these state parliaments. It is a 100% bottom-up flow of power.
The national government is built by the states are built by the localities, and the localities are built by the individual administrative units.
It completely flips the traditional pyramid.
But whenever you completely redesign a system of power, even one that is heavily localized and bottom-up, there is always the risk of it just devolving into a new kind of corrupt political machine.
Right.
Does the text offer any safeguards against that?
This raises an important question, and the document anticipates it by outlining incredibly strict anti-corruption guardrails. First, it mandates a hard, inflexible 2-term limit for any political office.
So no one can just camp out in a seat of power.
Exactly. The goal is to ensure no individual can consolidate patronage networks over decades.
The second safeguard they introduced genuinely surprised me. There is an explicit, legally binding ban on nepotism.
It's quite radical.
The text states that first-degree relatives of a president or a governor cannot run for that exact same office for at least 2 terms after their relative leaves.
The authors are actively trying to prevent the formation of political dynasties. Banning first-degree relatives for 2 full terms is a drastic measure, but the document clearly views inherited power as a critical threat to a fragile, localized democratic system.
It's a structural block designed to force new voices into the political arena.
Yes.
With all this power, representation, and resource control flowing down to the states and localities, we really need to clarify what the federal government actually does under this new operating system.
The federal government's portfolio shrinks dramatically under this proposal. It is restricted to strictly macro-level national matters.
What's on that list?
The source lists these as the armed forces and national intelligence, foreign affairs, currency and customs, national transport networks like federal railways and airports, and national parks.
That's it.
That's it. And the text emphasizes a critical legal default mechanism here. Any power, responsibility, or resource that is not explicitly granted to the federal government in the Constitution automatically defaults to the states.
Right. If it's not on that very short federal list, the center legally cannot touch it.
It represents a massive transfer of sovereignty back to the regions. But of course, a theoretical blueprint is pretty useless without a practical construction schedule.
Very true.
The authors provide a concrete 11-step roadmap to turn this theory into reality. What stood out to me is that this roadmap doesn't require waiting for the national politicians in Khartoum to magically fix themselves or sign a new peace treaty. The roadmap is designed to be initiated from the ground up, immediately, even in the midst of the current crisis.
Where does it begin?
It starts with step 1. Local units organizing at the grassroots level to elect their local councils. Once those are established, step 2 involves those councils forming the state parliaments.
And then the states start making their own laws.
Exactly.
Hmm.
From there, the new state parliaments draft the specific laws for their local reserve forces, establish their localized justice systems, and create their own state electoral commissions.
So they aren't waiting for permission.
Not at all. The document provides a proactive, step-by-step guide to building a parallel functional state apparatus from the bottom up.
To summarize the journey this document has taken us on today, we've explored a proposal that diagnoses a nation's devastating crises not as a temporary bug in the software, but as a core feature of an overly centralized operating system. The proposed fix is deeply mathematical, highly structural, and fiercely local. It is entirely focused on dismantling that 2% bottleneck and pushing power, resources, cultural autonomy, and security back to the absolute smallest administrative unit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the lessons embedded in this document extend far beyond the borders of Sudan. Whether you are analyzing a struggling nation-state, a failing multinational corporate bureaucracy, or even a sluggish local organization, absolute centralization almost always creates crippling bottlenecks.
It chokes everything out.
It stifles organic growth, destroys administrative efficiency, and inevitably breeds deep resentment among the people who are marginalized from the decision-making process. Distributed authority undoubtedly requires more coordination and work on the front end, but it builds incredibly resilient systems that can actually adapt to the diverse needs of the people operating within them.
Think about the organizations, the community groups, or even the family dynamics that you are a part of right now. Are any of them currently operating on a model of absolute centralization, where one single node, maybe even you, is making all the choices, controlling all the resources, and holding all the stress?
It's a heavy burden to bear.
It is. If you were to apply this blueprint and actively push the decision-making power down to the smallest administrative unit in your own life, what daily conflicts might just disappear? And more importantly, what new potential might be unlocked? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.